second of these sessions on the rise of China and the rescaling of global politics. So we've, for those of you there, had a fantastic first session. Looking forward to this one. Just for, in case you hadn't worked it out, there was supposed to be 4 papers. The third paper was withdrawn for various reasons about 2 weeks ago. So we have 3 papers. We have Filippo's, Zhengli's, and then Jojo's in that order. Before we get going, Indrajit, who is here, have you met, who shared the last session, is going to have a few discussant comments to sort of kick things off. So I will now hand over to Indrajit, but just reiterate, thanks again for uploading everything so timely and everything so clear. I actually think this format does work. I had my doubts 4 months ago, but now I'm actually quite liking it. Yeah. People don't overrun.
Right. Thanks, Giles. So I'm Indrajit. I'm senior lecturer in global development politics at the University of York, and I've been convening this and the previous session with Giles. Giles and I also co-run a monthly seminar series along with Professor Nana de Graaf at Vrije University, and the seminar series is titled China, Europe, and the Changing Global Order. So I think we'll have a link popped in the chat box at some point in case people are interested. So do get in touch if you want to be involved. Okay, as Giles said, I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for coming and our participants for uploading their contributions. Like Giles, I did worry about the workability of this format, but it's all looking good actually. So thanks. We've got 3 papers in this session, and I'll comment briefly on them. And after commenting on individual papers, I probably want to draw some emerging themes that are common across them to reflect on collective agendas for future work. So the first paper I want to discuss is by Filippo Boni at the Open University. Filippo's paper offers a really helpful analysis of the ideational component of China's strategic partnership with a focus on Sino-Italian relations. And Filippo situates his contribution against narratives of spheres of influence, that literature, which has come to dominate the IR work. And he highlights the relevance of bilateral strategic partnerships that China prefers or appears to prefer with individual countries. Through an analysis of some 1,300 news items, I think, which were published as part of a content sharing agreement between the Chinese and Italian news agencies, he shows how China invests in projecting its international status as a responsible power, how China emphasizes the supremacy of its own economy and technology in the wake of the pandemic, and indeed how the Chinese model was one to consider emulating. And we'll come back to this talk about the Chinese model, which Jojo also picks up in his paper. So it's a very nice sort of link. Anyway, so Filippo, your paper actually made me wonder about the characteristics of, what you call in the paper, the strategic partnerships, and how these are different from, if at all, from normal, regular bilateral relationships. What specific form, for instance, did the strategic partnership between China and Italy take? And I was quite interested in your method, because the method seems to suggest there is a content sharing agreement between the Italian and the Chinese news agencies. So was that part of the strategic partnership, or is there something else going on? So if you could tell us a bit more. And I wondered if you were drawing too much of a dichotomy between the strategic partnership literature and the spheres of influence literature, because could it be that some strategic partnerships lead to expanding China's sphere of influence, whereas others do not? I mean, clearly Italy seems to be in the latter sort of category, if at all. So, just some thoughts on that. And are strategic partnerships a tool which rising powers such as China are likely to use, since the spheres of influence approach is something that established powers have already fashioned, so they've already carved up the world, as it were, leaving no scope for new powers? I mean, what's going on? So if you could just sort of tell us, think about the dynamic link between the two approaches rather than separating them out. I wondered if that's something you had any thoughts on. The second paper I want to pick up now for discussion has been presented by Zhengli Huang at the Yongji University. Zhengli's paper offers insights into the dynamic logics of China's infrastructural capital. And she uses the case of the standard gauge railway in Kenya to argue against the statist and structuralist logics of infrastructure-based, the whole logic of spatial fixes. Against this, her paper argues that the contingent negotiations which the Chinese rail and bridge construction company had to undertake, not only while building the railway lines, which is what it was originally tasked to do, but also very interestingly, while operating it under a different name. So it's a very, very fascinating example of, the contingent negotiations to which, the Chinese operators are subjected. But Zhengli, your paper also opened up many questions for me. I wondered if you could tell us more about the role of agency in the Kenyan context. Clearly there are several stakeholders with whom CBRC, the bridge and road construction company, were dealing. And all of these stakeholders seem to be able to maneuver around the CBRC. But we also know that agency can be manipulated. And so I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how the CRBC navigated those diverse claims. And did it try and play one set of stakeholders against the other? So you actually give us tell us a great deal about the agency of the Kenyan stakeholders. But surely the CRBC also has some agency, and what was the dynamic sort of interaction? I wondered if there was something you could tell us more. I really like the importance of the contingent circumstances that you outline, and wondered how you reconcile these contingencies with the broader spatial fix literature on which you were drawing. And so your paper actually spoke very nicely to the strategic partnerships literature that Filippo referred, with the obvious caveat that in your case, the China's enterprises appeared to be undertaking several strategic partnerships, not with national governments, but also with stakeholders in Kenya. Now, were some stakeholders more strategic than others, and therefore could they be ignored, or did they need to be placated? So just a little more reflection would probably help. The third paper on our panel was by Jojo Nemsing at Leiden University. And Jojo's paper was, talked about the critical raw materials literature, especially the rare earth elements and sector, and the way in which Chinese state-backed firms were using their presence and involvement to reframe the global economy away from neoliberalism. That's what you suggest. Not only is the state playing a key role in the economy, especially in the extraction of these elements, but also one seems to see a move away, a move towards industrialization through more of natural resource exploitation, what has been called the extraction imperative. So of course, like any great paper, Jojo, yours opens up further questions. Could you tell us more about the Chinese firms that were involved in rare earths? As in, you referred generically to Chinese firms, but I wondered, they must have names and they must have dynamic sort of competition within them. If it's such a valuable sector, it couldn't be that, just one firm sort of gets away, or because of the nature of the state-backed firms, are there certain cronies who get all the contracts and others who don't? So could you tell us more about the firms that are involved in the rare earths? Do all firms involved have the same interests and strategies? And how do these firms interact with and negotiate with the clean energy initiatives that the state might seek to impose? And then, Jojo, you talk about the China model and you talk about how it might be transferable. And that's where I had some questions about how transferable do you really think the China model is? Or even how transferable do you think it's considered, given the very, very high capacity of the Chinese state, which goes back historic reasons. It's not about today or what happened in 1949. There's a reason the Chinese state is as strong as it is, and has the kind of capacity it does. So how transferable is the China model really? But this also nicely speaks to the previous conversations on the China model. So I think it was a great set of papers which sort of brought lots of issues together. I think in terms of common themes, if I may take another minute, in terms of common themes, what I really liked was the way in which the papers here, like the papers in the previous section, in the previous discussion, pointed out to the fact that there is really no singular China. And not even singular countries with which China is sort of investing. So it's not that there is, of course, there isn't a China, but there isn't a Kenya or an Italy. There are lots of actors and characters in each of these contexts. And I really like the way the papers, like the ones before, pull us away from state-centered narratives. And I think it's really useful to think about state-society relationships. And I think together one could really think about how states and societies in China interact with states and societies elsewhere. And it's not just states interacting with states, but societies interacting with societies and societies interacting with states. So it's really a very dense web, which is very nice to see. But I also think that these papers got us to reflect on what one might mean by power in the international, in the global politics context. I mean, we're all used to talking about China as a rising power, China as an emerging power, or the contentions between emerging powers and established powers. But what does power really mean? And there is a lot of, conversations around China having resources. Yes, of course, it has resources. It contains, economic, military resources. Yes, but power is also about influence. Power is also about the ability to set agendas. And I'm thinking of Evelyn Goh's work here on thinking about power and how China is able to influence or not, actors in Southeast Asia. So I think the papers also get us to think, not directly, but get us really to reflect on the limits to China's ability to influence and to translate its control over economic resources into any meaningful leverage or influence. I think that's really, really sort of useful. And of course, I was really very pleased to, think about how the papers contribute to rescaling global development, which is what Giles and I were thinking about when we put this panel together. The papers sort of remind us of how the world is changing and how Europe is not only a source of ideas and investments, but also a destination for those. And especially, it's part and parcel of the way in which the global South is sort of emerging. And we may have conversations about whether China is part of the global South or not, but a country that was historically sort of semi-colonized or colonized, now emerging as a donor, as a giver of aid and giver of ideas and giver of investment. I think it does contribute to getting us to think about global development very differently from what we've been used to. So thank you again for a great set of papers. And I'll now hand over to Giles, I think, to coordinate the questions or responses, as it might be.
Thanks a lot, Indrajit, and thanks everybody again for all the papers. I guess the first round of responses will go in order through Filippo, Zhengli, and then Jojo, but obviously there was provocations there, I think big ones from Indrajit for all of us. Plus we've also got in reserve the hickey question, our presidential question, about does incoherence create opportunities, or is it kind of a bad thing for the global South? Too much rope, as Sam said. So yeah, Filippo.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks Giles and Indrajit for putting this panel together, and thanks Indrajit for your very great comments. I'll focus on the first one. So, what is a strategic partnership? And that's a great question. It's something that, of course, I didn't have too much time to touch on the presentation, but it's an important one. And I think what is different about strategic partnerships is that it's a different form of interstate alignment. We're often used to looking at, bilateral ties in the form of alliances, in the form of coalitions. But one thing that it's really different between strategic partnerships and this more common frameworks that we're used to is that they are primarily goal-driven as opposed to security rather than threat-driven. So there is not necessarily an enemy against which to come together, but it's more of an attempt to build a relationship on some very concrete and discrete areas, whether it's economic cooperation, whether it's a security cooperation, it can be on a number of areas. Another important point, which I think it's interesting, and it's something I've tried to foreground in the paper, is that they are general framework agreements that really evolve and develop over time according to the needs of the moment. And here I link it to the question about the media partnership. So I think the media partnership is a really interesting point. Within the wider Italy-China partnership, which was established in 2004, in the paper I went through all of the official statements that were coming out of bilateral meetings between the two countries. And one of the things which was coming out was that, yeah, we should increase media cooperation, we should do more in terms of that type of interaction. It was a lot of rhetoric, very little substance, until the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative that Italy signed. That was the opportunity to sort of invest and bring up the media partnership and develop it further. So one of the things that I'm trying to sort of argue in the paper is that the strategic partnerships are an ideal tool that are not an ideal, a very useful tool that China is deploying to develop a series of touch points with partner countries across the years that can be sort of, developed more or less, and can be increased or decreased according to the need of the moment. So it's really a way to try and have a series of, bilateral interactions, whether it's in the field of media, whether it's with political parties, whether it's with city-to-city relations, which is something I look at in the paper. So it's really to look at the multiplicity of touch points that are developed within the strategic partnership framework. Another important thing that I think you mentioned, and I think it's very much true, it's about the multi-level nature. And this is something of looking at what China is. There's not one China, there are many Chinas as there are many partner countries. So a more relational approach and multi-level approach, I think it's what has really driven my analysis in the paper. And to this end, I've looked not just at the state-to-state interaction, but also, again, sub-state actors like media or city-to-city interactions, business-to-business ones. And this is not to say that the state is not in it, because of course there is some element of oversight and coordination from the top, but there is much more to that. And this is something that the literature on strategic partnership doesn't really take into account. It's more a state-to-state element, and there is more of a state-to-state understanding of how they work. So what I've tried to do in the paper is to bring in the sub-state dimension, which is more in line with a lot of the literature on China and the state transformation arguments that have been made before. So I hope this helps in sort of bringing a bit more to the fore what's new, what's the story in the paper. The point about strategic partnerships and spheres of influence, it's a really good one, and something I've been thinking. I guess my approach to this and why I sort of take a more critical angle to spheres of influence is that my assumption is that if we go down the route of spheres of influence, then we end up being caught in the sort of Cold War discussion and Cold War dynamics. So China is building a sphere of influence through strategic partnerships. That might be the ultimate aim, but that's not something I was particularly interested in doing in this paper. I was more interested in exploring the diplomatic practice and how things actually and how a new form of interstate alignment that rising powers such as China might be developing. And what might be interesting to see is whether this is a practice that can translate to other countries as well. I know that the European Union has strategic partnerships with other countries. The US have lots. But what is unique to China is that they have around 110 strategic partnerships with countries across the globe. So it's really a defining brand, if you like, of Chinese diplomacy in the past 30 years, which I thought was worth exploring rather than falling again into a trap of, yes, China is building a sphere of influence in Europe, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and it's doing so through strategic partnerships. But it's definitely not something, it's not a dichotomous, these are not really dichotomous concepts. One might feed into another. I just didn't want to fall into the very polarized debates that we now have around, the rise of China. So, but thanks, that's a very good prompt to think about and nuance perhaps some of the framing around this. So I think I've tried to answer briefly to some of your comments, and I'll stop here and leave room to others. And thanks again.
Thanks, Philippe. Zhengli, do you want to respond to Injidit's comments or any other thoughts you had?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this panel. Sorry, my connection is not very good, so
Sounds
I apologize
fine.
for that. Okay. First of all, I want to just add that this paper is co-authored with Lasoutis, Geddes Lasoutis, who unfortunately could not be here today. And I just want to stress on the part of agency. And indeed, agency is one of the key issues in our paper. In our paper, actually, we propose a triangular structure to basically simplify the stakeholder structure in the implementation of this project. And we put basically the Chinese SOE at the center of the structure. And that showcases that they have agency towards all sorts of directions. First of all, they were able to negotiate for the project on their own as a commercial activity. They proposed to the Kenyan government to contract or to implement this project, which was embedded in East Africa Community's plan for developing a Northern Corridor program. So it's part of that, and they were able to use that negotiation with the Kenyan government to ask for more funding from the Chinese state bank, in this case, Exim Bank. And then later on, with the support of the finance, they were able to implement and override even the constitution in Kenya, which dominates that any international infrastructure contracting should go through a bidding process, which they didn't do, but later on led to other challenges. And then they became operational for this project, not because of they think it's commercially beneficial, but rather they think this is only logical because of their identity as a policy tool from the Chinese government, because it will be risky to hand over this project, which is totally Chinese built, to a foreign company, which may lead to political cases or disputes between the Kenyan government and the Chinese government, or with another potential foreign company, whoever take over this project for operation. So it's a very interesting process. And for sure, we wanted to counter the argument, the very popular or dominating state-centric narratives in all sorts of global China or China-Africa literature. But I also find it challenging to find a proper, entry point for literature or for a better framework to understand better how to, understand the agency of the Chinese companies on its own. Because for sure, it's both a commercial and a political institution. And I would argue that in this case, in implementing these projects, they would prioritize their commercial interest first. because this is whatever drives them outward in the global market. But then they were later on also constrained by their political identity in implementing or maximizing their profit margins in these cases. Of course, a lot of literatures can be borrowed, one of them being C.K. Lee's very wonderful arguments of varieties of capitalism. And I also find, for example, Yuan An's argument of whatever she terms directed improvisation, a wonderful term to also, but maybe in this case of overseas Chinese institutions, not exactly directed improvise, but rather improvised direction or whatever more proper to understand it. But true, I also would like to maybe ask the same question to the other panelists in their investigations in the field. For example, Jojo's observation in the same way as Indrajit put it, there are different Chinese companies there. What are their agencies? Are they differentiated from each other? What do you think is the best framework to sort of describe this phenomenon? Thank you very much. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Cheng-Li. I'm going to slightly intervene in chairs. So I'm sorry to not go directly to Jojo, but he will get his time in the spotlight. Jay, I mean, there's a question from for Cheng-Li about, does that answer your question about, the question was, how does the triangular decision-making model link to the spatial fix concept? I guess, one of the critiques of Harvey's spatial fix was that he didn't focus, it was too capital centric. It didn't focus on the politics. Is that one response, Cheng-Li, to that question? And does Yue want to just speak their question rather than put it in the chat?
I think the spatial fix theory there's a lot to unpack, if we go too much into that. But we started this paper actually looking at the spatial fix of Chinese capitalism, and we thought, it's a very natural it's a very natural start point by looking at this tremendous investment of Chinese state capital in emerging markets like Africa. But you find a lot of footprints of the Chinese state capital following that logic of state spatial fix. But interestingly, if you read C.K. Lee's argument, there's this argument of Chinese capitalism as whether whole capitalism by itself, or is it more GDP-led growth? So there's a lot of debates about what's centric in that fix, the logic of fix. And I think that's a very interesting and intriguing question, because if you look at the growth path of China, the trajectory shows that it's indeed a directed process of accumulation. But first of all, there's a overarching purpose in that to keep the society stable. And that's also reflected in the going out of the Chinese capital. For example, in this case of the Kenyan SGR, the reputation of the Chinese company, and also the continuous partnership in a sense between the Chinese company and also the borrowing government, which is the Kenyan government in this case, is a overarching theme in all these negotiations. But is that workable in the sense of in a case of the partnership of bilateral relations, in the same sense that it has worked in the domestic market in China? So that's what I want to maybe address as a question in that sense. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we'll just go to Jojo. If you haven't spotted, you'll hear fantastic paper by Jojo off the strategically very important set of questions he raises. He's got a job going, which he's told you about there. If you want to, I suggest you go and apply for that if you can. If you want a 2-year job with Jojo, do that. He's probably too polite to pump his own job, but do go to that link, or if you've got students who might be interested in that. But Jojo, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Giles. So I want to start by saying I wasn't intending to write a China paper when I put this together. It was supposed to be a paper on globalization and whether we're moving towards a supply chain that's that's moving away from a China-centric supply chain. That was the initial idea, until a friend said, well, actually, before you can talk about that, maybe you should look into whether there is such a thing as a China model, because there are significant implications in the supply chain and how countries reposition themselves. So I want to start with that, because I think the question around, how do different firms and how does the state negotiate their position in the China model, start from that. I realized that in the paper that I sent, I actually did not include a table of the 6 major rare earth companies, basically. So the companies that we're looking at here are basically, there's 6 major rare earth companies which have more or less 70% control of the sector. Obviously, we're talking about rare earth elements, which is very specific. But then if you look at broadly mining companies in China, then you also have a different set of companies who are involved. But specifically on the rare earth sector, I just want to show you very quickly the supply chain, because it's always hard to talk about it unless you have like a visual of it. So most of the Chinese companies are at this stage have control all the way to the midstream sector, which means that not only do they have control over the mines, they also have been able to participate in the separation and the processing. And in fact, the reason why we have 97% control of the supply chain by China is because in the midstream sector that we're talking about, separation and processing technology, these are specific, this sector specifically is only controlled by China, meaning that even if you have rare earth elements which they do in Burundi, in South Africa, in Brazil, they can't enter the market because China has control over the processing technology. And I want to show you this because it also illustrates where the downstream actors come in, meaning new energy vehicle companies, wind turbines, solar panels. They occupy the last part, which is the advanced industrial application. So to me, actually, what's interesting is that there are some intermediate companies that are entering the market who are now just focusing on intermediate input. So for example, processing of permanent magnets, like the neodymium ion boron magnets, participation in the motor, sensor, electronic sector. So I think when I speak of the China model, we're really talking about, okay, you have 6 major rare earth companies that have control principally in the mining industry. But then for some reason, the state was able to coordinate through regulatory policies, through industrial policy as well, the presence of Chinese companies all the way from manufacturing of magnets all the way to advanced industrial applications. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a lot more going on in terms of that they're actually talking to each other. I think that, in fact, rare earth elements, REE companies will stay as REE companies for one simple reason, because they already have a comparative advantage. They already have the technology. And in particular, they have full control over heavy rare earth elements, heavy REE technology, separation and processing, which is what you need for the big industrial applications. So when I speak of, as you know, in the paper, I kind of went into the detail of what's the difference between a light and heavy rare earth elements, etc. But to put it simply, you have 17 elements that companies have the ability to develop specific technologies, specific applications, so they don't need to compete with each other. So I think this is also, one of the most important things to realize is that there's a lot more state coordination that is taking place. A lot of the regulatory policies on export quota, production quota, these have implications to the incentives of how REE companies would maintain their competitive advantage. Now, I want to go back to, I just want to respond to the last question on the transferability debate on China. And I want to echo what Zheng Li was talking about. We talked about, I also take the view that I think Yuan Ang's argument here is really interesting, because what she's basically saying about China is that the Chinese wanted all kinds of investment. So it's like quantity over quality. And then at some stage, they switched to more control over quality, looking at high quality investments. And I think if there is a lesson that can be drawn from the China model, it's that the state was able to change its investment policy from one that is simply attracting all kinds of FDI to a much more selective FDI so that it can improve the quality. So the idea that you start from creating competition among local elites, among regional governments, and then moving towards more market building institution. The second point about the transferability debate is, and Giles will know this, in the mining industry, we don't have a lot of models of how mining can lead to economic development. And so I think what's so interesting about China is that they've managed to close the production and the consumption side. And that what it's simply saying is that in terms of adding value, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of sector-specific linkages, the Chinese were able to harmonize their industrial policies, their planning strategy, such that it enables the REE companies to maintain their competitive advantage. And I think that this is one of the major lessons that we can draw out from the China model. The project compares China, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. We've already done a couple of fieldwork in Brazil, and one of the most interesting findings we have there is that their biggest company in niobium, CBMM, decided not to invest in rare earth elements because they don't want to compete directly from China, but instead focused on industrial applications of niobium. And so I think what the lesson there is actually companies who are in the same sector as the Chinese companies are trying to learn from the Chinese. They literally said that in one of the interviews was like, well, you can't compete with China because the price, but also they have technology. So we just need to look for another application in the clean energy sector where we can develop specific technologies that would allow us to take advantage and close that loop as well. So they focused on niobium and not on rare earth elements. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Jojo. I'm aware of time. There's a plenary at 1. Should we say go another 5 minutes? I guess because we've so far just had a round of responses to discussants. This might be a lesson for the DSA organisers that we need more than 40 minutes. And there's been some messages in the chat, although I think one of the questions has been answered. So do people, I've seen there's one from Nick as well, just come in. Does anybody want to ask their question to camera, or are they happy for me to triage them on the chat?
I mean, I can ask in
okay,
directly if you
thanks,
like.
Nick. Yeah.
Sure. So Jojo, thanks for that. It's a really interesting paper. I mean, the reason I asked this is because I've been doing a little bit of work with Unibel Dakova on lithium in Bolivia, and it looks quite different. Just because I also, it struck me that you use sort of state capitalism. You reference the kind of Dixon and Lamy version of this, which is stressing the idea that it's more of a global tendency than one that's localized to particular national models, which would be more like the Andris Nolka thing or something like that. So then I was a bit surprised that you then stressed the uniqueness of China, and it certainly seems to fit for rare earths. That argument is made very well, I think. But then it made me think about whether this is like something to do with temporality, because China gets a head start in rare earths from a long time ago. It's established a dominance in the industry, which means that it's very difficult, as you know, for kind of European firms, European states to kind of come in and compete. Whereas if you look at something like lithium, where there isn't that head start, you have seen, I gave the example of, German sort of state capital partnerships. So I wonder, in the context of the last 3, 4, 5 years or whatever, where you've had this sort of global state capitalism turn, if you accept that, whether that has become more of a universalized thing, but then you get China, sort of the China model, quote unquote, being more unique in kind of the 1990s, early 2000s, something like this.
Do you want me to have a go at that, Giles?
Yep. I've got one question. Okay, Yixian, you've got a question. Would it be a good question to take together, or is it a totally different question?
It's also a question to Jojo, but
okay, ask it and then he can.
Okay.
He can try and juggle 2 at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Jojo. Thanks for sharing the paper. I think I like it and like the argument. I think you elaborate already in responding to a previous question about the coordination problem. But I think I was still wondering the challenges to implement the coordination. As we know, there are so many actors within the state and also like across the scale. So how I mean, if we think about this strategic plan from the top, so how this plan can be implemented. And also I think initially when we think about the rise of these mining companies, my observation is really kind of hugely driven by commercial interest. It's not really about strategic plan or interest. So I think these are the questions. I'm happy to talk also afterwards. So I'll stop here.
Okay, so you have a couple of minutes, Jojo, and then I think we're afraid we have to wrap up.
Yeah, okay. So I think the first on the issue of I'll take in the coordination question. So one of the things that the Chinese have done 2 years ago, or like I think a year ago, is to create a super SOE. They forced the merger of 3 out of the 6 companies, which now has some high levels of control over the reserves, and then of course processing technology. So I mean, that would be to me an indication of the growing interest of the Chinese state to maintain that political control, but also economic. So I think the other thing is we should remember that it's not in the interest of China to just have a monopoly in the RE sector for one simple reason, because this is an extremely environmentally degrading, at high cost, high social and environmental cost. So in fact, the Chinese have been wanting other countries to establish rare earth REE mining projects. The problem, of course, is that that hasn't happened, mainly because the countries are not willing to accept. In the context of the EU, they wouldn't want any new rare earth projects here. In Brazil, they can do recycling, so they don't need to create a supply chain based from primary mineral extraction. So a lot of these factors basically mean that we're still going to be dependent on China in the next couple of years. But I think they would welcome increased participation of REE companies. In particular, we now see like Australia taking a much bigger share of the in the market, because they're one of the few countries that have Lynas is one of the few companies that have a refining plant. On the question of state capitalism, so my view on this really, and I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly. So what I would say that the consolidation of REE control in China it's actually a long process. It wasn't intended that they would create, in particular, because from the 1980s all the way to early 2000, that was an open, there was a chance for Western companies to participate in the market. But instead, what happened was that the US decided to close their REE company. They closed their mineral sector because it was, again, based for environmental reasons. They didn't want rare earth exploitation in the US. Now, of course, 20 years after, Trump comes in and says, we are extremely vulnerable from China, so we need to restart this REE supply chain. So I think there's a lot more contingency, and it's not historically predetermined that they would have exercised this control. So I know that literature that Ilyas and Adam Dixon are writing on, but so my position with that is I actually think that I tend to see that there are more specific features of Chinese state capitalism, and I don't necessarily see it as being extended across different parts of the world. I think that what is clear is that there are certain lessons that are being drawn from Chinese industrial policy, but not necessarily Chinese state capitalism as a whole. And I think the Chinese have been also very clear that what they have is something that's historically specific to them, socialism with capitalist characteristics or whatever you want to call it. And I think that if you look, for example, like Africans going to China to study industrial policy, that kind of policy learning is really more focused at the level of policy emulation, as opposed to thinking about how to exert political control. So yeah, I think I'm not as convinced as Adam and Ilyas that we're seeing a sort of a global move. Also, because I work on Brazil, and Brazil is very hard to classify as state capitalist at this point. So to me, it's like, no, I think it's a more specific incident that we can see in some places. It's uneven, but I don't think it's a global tendency.
Okay, I'm sure there's lots of questions and thoughts that people have. I guess we do have access to everybody's emails through the wonders of Nomad IT or whatever. So I guess if you've got questions for speakers that you haven't had a chance to ask, do get in touch with them directly. But yeah, just want to thank you all again. I thought that was really great. As I say, I'm a bit frustrated that 40 minutes doesn't seem to be long enough, but I think this is quite a good model, so I will feed that back to DSA. But yeah, as I said, what really impressed me, and if this happens again next year, I'm going to make sure I do as good a job, is that I thought the videos were really great as sort of succinctly kind of capturing everything you wanted to say, and then having papers or PowerPoints on top was also great. So it does give this freedom for the discussion, which has been really thought-provoking. I've got lots of scrawled notes here that I'm going to keep reflecting on. So thanks again. Go and enjoy your lunch. You have 22 minutes now to go and stuff your faces and come to the plenary, which looks quite interesting actually on kind of the role of knowledge in global change. So thanks again, and thanks Indrajit for co-convening and everything.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. I hope we can stay in touch and sort of really think about these research collaborations. Yeah.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.